churches are coping with the changing times and what they're doing to try to keep their doors open.
Across the nation, there are hundreds of thousands of religious congregations. Some of the biggest, known as megachurches, are facing challenges as the culture around organized religion changes.
At one point, Joel Osteen's massive 16,000-seat sanctuary in Houston was filled week after week, becoming a symbol of modern faith and optimism. But lately, something has shifted in a way that's hard to ignore. Rows that once overflowed now show quiet gaps, and the energy that defined the space feels different. What's causing this slow decline? Changing beliefs? Rising criticism? Or something deeper happening behind the scenes? The answer may be more unsettling than it appears. The megachurch boom that changed American faith. Across the United States, church life has always played a central role in communities, shaping values, identity, and daily routines. From small rural chapels to busy urban congregations, thousands of churches formed a wide spiritual landscape where people gathered for meaning and connection. But over time, a new kind of church began to rise, one that looked and felt very different from traditional worship spaces. These were the mega-churches, large-scale ministries designed to hold thousands of people under one roof. As highlighted by Lisa Desjardins, they represented a shift in how faith was experienced, blending modern culture, media, and religion into one highly structured environment. Instead of quiet, simple sanctuaries, these churches introduced a more dynamic and immersive form of worship that reflected the pace of modern life. Walking into a megachurch was not like entering a traditional church building. It often felt closer to stepping into a large event space, carefully designed for experience and impact. Massive seating areas filled with thousands of attendees, advanced lighting systems, professional-grade sound, and giant screens displaying sermons created an atmosphere that felt both emotional and highly engaging. Everything was arranged with precision to keep attention focused and energy flowing. One of the most well-known examples of this model is Lakewood Church, led by Joel Osteen. Located in a repurposed sports arena, it has the capacity to hold around 16,000 people at once. On Sundays, the entire complex transforms into a highly organized system of movement and activity. Parking lots fill early, volunteers guide traffic, and inside the building, people move through cafes, bookstores, and wide corridors filled with conversation and anticipation. It is not just a worship service, it operates like an entire ecosystem built around weekly gatherings. Lakewood is part of a much larger pattern. Across the country, roughly 1,600 megachurches have adopted similar approaches, each creating their own version of large-scale worship experiences. Some even expanded far beyond traditional expectations, adding features like gyms, cafes, children's centers that resemble schools, and entertainment-style production setups. The idea was simple but powerful. Faith should feel accessible, engaging, and relevant to modern life. This movement was shaped by influential leaders such as Robert Schuller, Rick Warren, and Bill Hybels, who each explored different ways of making church more approachable to larger audiences. Their combined vision helped redefine what church could look like in the modern world, turning it into something more than a weekly gathering. It became an experience. By the early 2000s, megachurches were no longer an experiment. They had become a dominant force in American Christianity. Pastors turned into public figures, authors, and media personalities whose influence extended far beyond church walls. Some even became voices in cultural and political conversations, showing just how far their reach had grown. From the outside, everything looked strong, even unstoppable. The system was growing, expanding, and attracting millions. But beneath that success, subtle shifts were already forming, quiet changes that most people did not notice at first. And slowly, those hidden shifts would begin to raise a difficult question. Could something this large and influential eventually start to weaken from within? That question would soon become impossible to ignore as deeper cracks began to surface. The moment megachurch leaders faced an uncomfortable truth. For years, everything appeared to be working exactly as intended. Megachurches were growing, attendance was strong, and programs were expanding at a steady pace. From the outside, it looked like a thriving spiritual ecosystem, organized, energetic, and full of life. But beneath that surface, a quieter question was beginning to form, one that would eventually challenge the very foundation of the movement. Were people actually growing in faith, or were they simply attending services out of habit and routine? That question did not remain theoretical for long. In 2007, Bill Hybels, the founding pastor of Willow Creek Community Church, decided to investigate it directly. His church had long been considered one of the leading examples of modern ministry success, often studied and replicated by others. But instead of celebrating growth, Hybels chose to examine something far more uncomfortable: the actual spiritual condition of the people inside his congregation. An internal study was launched, designed not to highlight achievements, but to measure real transformation. The results were unexpected, even unsettling. On the surface, participation levels looked strong. People attended services regularly, joined volunteer teams, and took part in small group activities. The structure of engagement was clearly in place. But when deeper questions were asked about personal spiritual growth, the answers told a very different story. Many individuals admitted they did not feel significantly changed in their daily lives. They were active within the church environment, but internally, something felt stagnant. Their faith participation had become consistent, but not necessarily transformative. A growing number of attendees described their experience in a way that surprised church leadership. Instead of seeing themselves as spiritually developing individuals, they felt more like participants in an organized system. They would attend, receive teaching, enjoy the experience, and then return to normal life, but without a strong sense that anything lasting had shifted within them. This realization was difficult to ignore. The church had successfully created an engaging environment, but engagement did not automatically equal deep spiritual formation. The concern was not attendance, it was dependency. Many were drawing their sense of spiritual fulfillment primarily from the weekly experience rather than developing it internally or within personal practice. Even more striking was what happened next. Instead of hiding the results, Hybels publicly acknowledged them. He admitted that while the church had grown in size and activity, it may have unintentionally created a system where people were more connected to programming than to personal spiritual depth. It was an honest admission that few leaders at that level are willing to make. Yet even with that revelation, the movement did not slow down. In fact, it continued to expand. More churches adopted similar models, more programs were introduced, and services became even more refined. The outward momentum remained strong, but internally, something more subtle was shifting. Messages in many churches also began to evolve. Sermons leaned more toward encouragement, inspiration, and emotional uplift. Difficult or challenging teachings were often softened to maintain accessibility and appeal. The goal was clear: keep people engaged and returning. And for a time, it worked. Crowds remained large, energy stayed high, and everything still looked successful from the outside. But underneath that consistency, a fragile pattern was forming, one built on experience rather than depth. And when that pattern was eventually disrupted, it would expose just how dependent the entire system had become on one thing no one fully questioned, until everything changed. The shutdown that exposed everything. At first, it did not feel like history shifting. It felt temporary. March 2020 arrived with confusion, uncertainty, and reassurance from leaders who believed the disruption would pass quickly. Across the United States, church buildings closed their doors, including massive megachurches that had once welcomed thousands every week. Services were quickly moved online. Cameras replaced stages, living rooms replaced sanctuaries, and live streams replaced crowded auditoriums. Pastors continued speaking, trying to maintain stability through screens instead of physical presence. The message was consistent everywhere. This is only a pause, not a permanent change. At the beginning, most leaders assumed the same outcome: People would return once restrictions were lifted. The expectation was simple and almost certain. After months apart, the desire to gather again would naturally bring crowds back. The emotional connection, the music, the shared experience, everything would restore itself. But as time passed, something unexpected began to happen. People adapted faster than anyone anticipated. Sunday routines changed. Some continued watching services online, while others slowly stopped tuning in at all. What surprised many leaders was not just the shift in attendance, but the emotional response, or lack of it. The absence of physical gatherings did not create the level of longing that had been expected. Instead, something quieter emerged. Distance changed perception. Without the atmosphere of a packed room, the experience of church felt different. The energy was no longer shared in the same way. The music, the lighting, the collective response, all of it became compressed into a screen. And in that format, something subtle shifted. The emotional intensity that once defined the experience began to fade. As people adjusted, they started noticing details they had previously overlooked. Messages that once felt powerful in a large auditorium began to feel more repetitive when heard alone. Common phrases about hope, breakthrough, and future blessings did not always carry the same emotional impact when separated from the environment that once amplified them. This created a quiet but important shift in thinking. Many individuals began reflecting on their connection to church in a deeper way. Was their engagement built on personal conviction or on the atmosphere created around them? Was it the message itself that sustained them or the experience surrounding it? For some, this became a turning point. One example was Jennifer Martinez, a longtime church attendee who had spent years in a large, high-energy congregation. During the shutdown, she found herself exploring different expressions of faith. Instead of returning immediately to large gatherings, she visited smaller communities, places where services were quiet, slower, and more reflective. The difference was striking. There were no production lights, no large screens, no overwhelming crowd, just a small group, speaking, listening, and reflecting together. In that simplicity, she experienced something she had not expected: depth, not excitement, but clarity, not performance, but presence. Her experience reflected a wider trend. When restrictions were eventually lifted, the expected return did not fully happen. Large churches reopened their doors, but attendance numbers told a different story. Many seats remained empty. Some people returned, but not at the scale leaders had anticipated. And even more concerning, the decline did not fully reverse over time. What had once been assumed as a temporary interruption revealed something deeper. The system had not only been paused, it had been examined. And in that pause, people had begun to reassess what they were actually looking for in their spiritual lives. Some returned with renewed intention. Others quietly moved toward smaller communities, private practices, or entirely different expressions of faith. The connection to large gatherings was no longer automatic. It had become a choice. And that shift raised a new and uncomfortable reality. If people no longer needed the large gathering in the same way they once did, then what exactly was holding the system together in the first place? That question would soon begin to reshape everything that followed, leading directly into the hidden issues that had been building long before the shutdown ever began. Inside the dark side of modern church culture, as large churches continued to grow, something subtle began to shift in how faith was being experienced. On the surface, everything still looked vibrant. Music was powerful, messages were uplifting, and crowds remained engaged. But beneath that energy, deeper patterns were forming that slowly changed the direction of spiritual life for many people. One of the earliest concerns was the growing focus on personal benefit. Faith, for many attendees, began to feel increasingly centered on individual needs, personal breakthroughs, emotional healing, and life improvement. While there is nothing unusual about seeking support through faith, the concern was that the broader sense of community and selflessness started to fade into the background. Instead of a shared spiritual journey, it slowly became more about personal outcomes. Alongside this shift came a noticeable change in messaging. Many sermons leaned heavily toward encouragement and positivity, focusing on hope, success, and emotional uplift. While these messages were comforting, they often avoided deeper or more uncomfortable topics such as struggle, sacrifice, or spiritual accountability. Over time, faith began to resemble motivation more than transformation. It became something that made people feel better in the moment, rather than something that challenged or reshaped them over time. Another emerging issue was the way spiritual leadership was being understood. In some environments, teachings subtly positioned spiritual life as something that primarily served personal desires. Instead of emphasizing surrender, discipline, and growth, the focus often shifted toward fulfillment and personal expectation. This created an unspoken idea that faith existed mainly to support individual goals, rather than to call people into deeper responsibility or change. At the same time, the structure of large gatherings introduced another challenge. In massive environments, it was easy for individuals to remain unseen within the crowd. While this created comfort for some, it also reduced deeper personal accountability and connection. Relationships became harder to form in meaningful ways, and many attendees experienced church more as an event they attended rather than a community they actively belonged to. Over time, the sense of personal involvement weakened. Then came another pattern: constant emotional stimulation. High-energy worship, carefully designed environments, and emotionally driven messages created powerful experiences. But those experiences often depended on the atmosphere itself. When that environment was absent, the emotional impact sometimes diminished. This created a cycle where engagement relied heavily on repeated experiences rather than sustained internal growth. Gradually, these patterns shaped a quiet but significant transformation. Faith, for many, was no longer just about spiritual depth or personal change. It was becoming an experience shaped by external elements. And while this model continued to attract large crowds, it also raised an important question that could no longer be ignored. What happens when the experience no longer feels enough? Because beneath all the production, messages, and structure, something else was forming, something that would soon be revealed not through teaching, but through change. And when that change finally arrived, it would force many to rethink everything they thought they understood about modern church life, leading into a future that no longer looked as certain as it once did. White empty seats became impossible to ignore. By the time 2023 arrived, the quiet changes that had been building for years were no longer subtle. They were visible. Across many large churches, attendance had begun to decline in ways that leaders could not easily dismiss. Reports showed drops of 30 to 40% in some congregations. But the deeper concern was not just the numbers themselves. It was who was leaving. It was not just casual visitors or occasional attendees stepping away. Longtime members, committed volunteers, and even generous supporters were slowly disengaging. The foundation that once kept these massive communities stable was beginning to weaken from within. Well-known churches across the United States started feeling the impact in different ways. Saddleback Church experienced a noticeable shift in attendance following major leadership transitions, showing how closely many people were connected not just to the message, but to the person delivering it. Meanwhile, Willow Creek Community Church continued to face the aftermath of leadership controversies that had deeply affected trust within its community. In another case, Mars Hill Church eventually collapsed entirely after internal conflicts and leadership issues became impossible to contain. These were not isolated incidents. They pointed to a larger pattern unfolding across the megachurch landscape. Something about the model that had once felt unstoppable was now under pressure from multiple directions at once. At the same time, cultural attitudes were shifting rapidly, especially among younger generations. Many were no longer drawn to large, structured religious institutions in the same way previous generations had been. Instead, they were seeking environments that felt more personal, more honest, and less performative. Conversations about doubt, struggle, and real-life challenges were becoming more important than polished presentations or large-scale productions. Technology also played a significant role in this transformation. In earlier years, megachurches had a clear advantage. They could deliver high-quality sermons, music, and events that were difficult for smaller communities to match. But the rise of digital platforms changed everything. Now, spiritual teachings, discussions, and alternative perspectives were accessible to anyone with a phone or internet connection. People no longer needed to attend a massive service to engage with spiritual content, since digital access made participation possible from anywhere, shifting the way individuals experienced and practiced faith in more personal and flexible ways beyond physical church gatherings alone experience. This shift quietly raised a difficult question. What made the megachurch experience unique anymore? If inspiration, teaching, and community could be accessed anywhere, what was the defining value of gathering in such large physical spaces? Different churches began responding in different ways. Some tried to adapt by creating smaller, more intimate gatherings within their larger systems, focusing on relationships rather than scale. Others doubled down on production, trying to enhance the experience with even more advanced technology and media-driven presentations. But not all were able to adjust successfully. Some continued to shrink, their once full auditoriums slowly marked by rows of empty seats. And yet, this moment was not only about decline, it was also about transformation. Across many places, smaller faith communities began to grow quietly, in homes, cafes, and informal gatherings where conversation replaced performance and connection felt more personal. For people like Marcus Thompson, this shift was not about walking away from faith, but about rediscovering it in a simpler, more grounded way. What was emerging was not the end of belief, but the end of one specific model of expressing it. The megachurch era, once defined by scale and visibility, was beginning to give way to something different, something quieter, more personal, and still unfolding. And as the lights dimmed in once packed sanctuaries and silence slowly filled the empty rows, one question remained hanging in the air. Was this the decline of something powerful or the beginning of something entirely new? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more insightful content. Share your thoughts below and don't miss the next powerful video on screen.